Hey everybody! The overwhelming majority of biblical scholars agree that the Pastoral Epistles, 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus, were not written by Paul but were written decades after his death. Therefore, Philippians was also not written by Paul. My name is Dan Bartholomew and I'm a biblical scholar, therefore you should unquestionably trust everything I'm about to say. Let's get cooking. Looking at the external evidence, there's something interesting. Despite referencing several of Paul's letters like Romans, 1 Corinthians, Ephesians, and Colossians, the 2nd century church father Ignatius never once quotes from Philippians. Similarly, Justin Martyr doesn't seem to refer to or cite Philippians in any of his writings. Then there's Polycarp, who wrote a letter to the Philippians. While he hints at ideas found in Philippians, he never explicitly attributes these thoughts to Paul, suggesting that they might have been part of an oral tradition rather than directly penned by Paul. Interestingly, Polycarp doesn't hesitate to attribute other quotes from 1 Corinthians to Paul. Now let's look at the internal evidence. To start, Paul's letter to the Philippians in Greek has about 2,183 words. And here's the kicker. There are around 36 words in this letter that you won't find anywhere else in the New Testament. What's really interesting is that the vocabulary used in Philippians is more in line with what you'd see in writings from later church fathers. It raises the question, why didn't Paul toss these words around in his other letters? This change in his usual style really makes you wonder about the authenticity of Philippians. And get this, the same discussions about unique words are used to debate whether the pastoral epistles are legit. So if those letters are labeled as fakes, then seeing unusual vocabulary in Philippians raises some serious doubts about who really wrote it. Second, the mention of overseers and deacons in Philippians, which are terms Paul uses exclusively in the Pastorals. These seem a bit ahead of Paul's time, hinting at a more organized church structure seen in later periods. In Philippians 1, Paul brings up these roles in the church, something he doesn't really talk about in his other letters, but dives into extensively in the Pastorals, like in 1 Timothy 3, 1 or Titus 1, 7. This combo of overseers and deacons in Philippians, not found elsewhere in Paul's writing but present in the Pastorals, strongly suggests a structured church leadership like what's detailed in those disputed letters. So, this similarity in the way church roles are described in both Philippians and the Pastorals really raises questions about who wrote what. If Paul didn't write the Pastorals, it's quite plausible he didn't write Philippians either. Third, when you look at the opponents in Philippians and those in the Pastorals, you'll see some striking similarities. Both groups are really hung up on following the law, and there's confusion about the resurrection that shows up in both places, like in Philippians 3:12, 16, and 2 Timothy 2:18. In Philippians 3, the author is talking about people claiming to be already perfect, which goes against his usual teachings about perfection through Jesus Christ and the final resurrection. This whole idea of achieving perfection, whether through sticking to the law or through some sort of premature enlightenment, maybe hints at Gnostic or other heretical beliefs that are more at home in the early 2nd century. These similarities between the adversaries in Philippians and those in the Pastorals really shake up the idea that Paul wrote Philippians. The Pastorals also seem to stray from the typical Pauline beliefs. They gloss over key ideas like the fatherhood of God, union with Christ, the Holy Spirit's role, and the importance of the cross. Surprisingly, Philippians, also credited to Paul, mirrors this lack of emphasis on these essential Pauline themes. Then there's this trend in the Pastorals. A big deal is made about passing on sound teaching and the faith and relying on tradition and creeds, like in 1 Timothy 3:16, for instance. This feels more like late 1st century Christianity than what Paul was preaching. Philippians, in line with this, doesn't give much airtime to typical Pauline themes either. The Holy Spirit gets minimal mention. And Paul drops what many scholars think is a creedal saying or Christian hymn in Philippians, which rings a bell from what we see in the Pastorals. All these differences, stacked up against what we expect from Paul's letters, seriously calls into question that Paul wrote Philippians. Tradition tells us that Paul wrote Philippians from Rome, but Acts doesn't drop a single hint that Timothy was there with Paul in that city. And then there's Epaphroditus, a crucial figure in understanding what was going on in Philippians, yet Acts doesn't mention him either. Plus, there's this feud between Euodia and Syntyche in Philippians, something Acts stays completely silent about. Using the same criteria scholars apply to the Pastorals, these missing details in Acts prove that Philippians wasn't written by the Apostle Paul. If these considerations combine to convince the overwhelming majority of biblical scholars that the Pastoral Epistles were not written by Paul, but were composed decades after his death, either toward the end of the 1st century CE or in the opening years of the 2nd century CE, therefore, you shouldn't think Paul wrote Philippians either. And this is why you should trust me. Because what I'm saying here is basically just science. I'm using the most rigorous standards of biblical scholarship, and only fundamentalist evangelical apologists would disagree with me. So there you have it. Paul didn't write Philippians. It's yet another forgery in the Bible.